Alright everyone, in this video we're going to go over how to annotate a prompt, specifically one on periodic trends. So we're going to have a series of these videos going through the different prompts that you'll find in this document, and it's going to be helpful because really knowing what is in these documents can help us review our vocabulary and how to construct our essay. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to read through the document, and as we read, we're going to underline our key vocabulary words and circle any directional terms that are telling us to do something. So let's go ahead and begin. It says a team of chemists recently acquired samples of an unknown element. Well, element is definitely one of our vocabulary words in chemistry, and it's found on Mars. The unknown element was tested in the chemistry lab to explore its properties. That's another word. Okay. The team has been tasked with determining if the element is a metal or a non-metal. To complete this task, the team will examine where the unknown element would be located on the periodic table and use periodic trends to explain the reactivity of this element. One thing I like to do when I'm annotating a prompt is if I've figured out underline some vocabulary words, if they're ones that I know the definition to, I can go ahead and write it down. That way I can use it later in my essay. And you don't have to do it for all of them, but just a few added definitions can really help boost your essay. So for example, I know that elements are unique atoms. Okay. And we know that, let's see, properties are just descriptions of the physical and chemical characteristics. And let's see, let's pick another one. Let's look at reactivity. So reactivity is the ability to react with a substance. Okay, all right, so now let's look at the next part. So our writing task, construct an explanation. The word construct is a directional term. It's telling me to do something, so I'm going to circle it. About the relationship between the reactivity of the unknown element and its position to the periodic table. So one thing is, it's not a vocabulary word, so I might just highlight it, but it's the relationship between the reactivity and its position. So that's going to be the main focus of the essay. And while we're doing that, they tell us to identify the unknown element as either a metal or non-metal, so we have those vocabulary words again, and determine the group on the periodic table to which the unknown element would most likely belong. So one thing we know is that group is a column on the periodic table. That's up and down. There are 18 of them. We know that metals and non-metals, metals are to the left of the staircase on the periodic table, and non-metals are to the right of the staircase on the periodic table. So we can use that to help us. Then in our second bullet point, it tells us to predict whether the ionization energy, that's a new vocabulary word in our prompt, and electronegativity of the unknown element would be higher or lower than the other elements in the same group if it were in the 8th period. Okay, so for ionization energy and electronegativity, I'm going to have to write those definitions out on the side. But our ionization energy, which I'm just going to abbreviate it as IE, and electronegativity as EN. So ionization energy is the energy required to remove an electron. And one thing that's important is to note that if you have a strong attractive force between the protons and the electrons, then the ionization energy is very high. Okay. And electronegativity is the ability to pull an electron in a bond. Okay. And same thing, if you have a high attractive force, that means you will have a high electronegativity. Okay, so it follows the same pattern as the ionization energy. And then remember, a period, that's a row on the periodic table. So if it were in the 8th period, there are only 7 periods right now on the periodic table. So if the 8th one is a made up row, it's a hypothetical. Okay, and now also they're telling us to justify. I forgot to circle that. Okay, and then they ask us to explain how this unknown element reacts with other elements on the periodic table. Okay, so just by underlining my vocabulary word and jotting down the definitions of things that I know, I can really have a good jump on my essay. Now, one thing to keep in mind is as you're writing a gateway essay, your scientific background is this is what goes in your introduction. The identify element X, this is your title. It's also going to be the theme of your essay. And then each bullet point should be its own body paragraph. So this is body paragraph number 1, body paragraph number 2, body paragraph number 3. And in a different video, I'll show you how to turn your prompt into a essay, or into into an essay, but also into a very specific introduction and conclusion paragraph, because I know that those can be the trickiest. Now let's go through the documents, because the documents are really important, but you kind of have to really analyze them. So if we look at document A, the title of it is Reaction of Element X with Oxygen. So we're going to have to really think about what we know about oxygen. One thing that we know is, remember, on the periodic table, the charges of our elements can be found by what column they're in. So oxygen is in column 16, and it has a -2 charge. And so what we can see here is that this is we also know that based on where the staircase is, okay, that oxygen is a nonmetal. And so if element X is reacting with oxygen and this is a nonmetal, then what's most likely happening is that X is a metal. Okay, that we have this opposite. So we also know that this means that they'll form an ionic bond. And when you have an ionic substance, okay, so for example, X2O, remember, you have to balance your charges. So if we know that we have X and we have 2 of them, and we have 1 oxygen, oxygen has a -2 charge, and that X has to balance out the -2 charge, so +2. And that means that each X must have a +1 charge. So anything with a +1 charge is right here. So that means element X must be in column number 1 on the periodic table. So what are some things we know about column number 1, or group number 1? Okay, we know that they are called the alkali metals. We know that since they're in column 1, they have 1 valence electron, which are the electrons on the outer shell. We know that they react, they react quickly, but that's because they are the most reactive metals on the periodic table. Okay, so we've got some information. So a lot of this was something that we had to pull a lot out of using our background knowledge. So don't be afraid to just say, okay, I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to get from this, but I do know that it can lead me down other paths, like what do I know about the things that are in this picture or document. So if we look at document B, we see reactions of metals with chlorine. So we see that when a group 1 metal, which we know that's what our alkali metal is, when it reacts with chlorine, you end up with 1 of the sodiums and 1 chlorine. When group 2 reacts with chlorine, you end up with 1 magnesium and 2 chlorines. And when a group 3 metal, like aluminum, reacts with chlorine, you end up with 1 aluminum and 3 chlorine. So remember, this is because the charges are different. You have +1, +2, and +3, whereas chlorine is in column 17, and chlorines all have a -1 charge. So you have to make sure that your charges are balanced there. So document B can help you with that. And let's see, if we look at document C, we have one of our periodic tables, and they tell us we have an increasing electronegativity. So that means we have a high electronegativity in the top right corner, and we have the low electronegativity in the bottom left corner. And we know that increasing electronegativity means that we have an increasing attractive force between our protons and our electrons. So we can see this pattern here. So if we know that column 1, which is our alkali metals, we know that they're farthest to the left. So out of all of the families, okay, they're going to have the lowest electronegativity. And then our prompt mentioned that it would be in the 8th period. And so the 8th period, remember, there's 7 rows or 7 periods right now. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if there was a period 8, okay, period 8 would have the lowest electronegativity out of all of them, especially if element X was right here, okay? It would have a lower electronegativity than francium, and it would be the lowest on the entire periodic table. So we can see that document C helps us with electronegativity, and that's mentioned in bullet point number 2. And so we would really want to use this document in bullet point number 2 or body paragraph number 2. And document D is about ionization energy, which again is also in bullet point number 2. So one thing we know is, okay, we already decided that we're looking for the alkali metals in column number 1, and we know that that's hydrogen and lithium and sodium and potassium. And what we see is a general downward trend, okay? So that means as we, so hydrogen, lithium, sodium, potassium. So as they went down, the potassium had a lower ionization energy than hydrogen did, which meant hydrogen had a higher ionization energy. And if we look at our rows, for example, we can see in row 1, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon. That's period number 2 or row number 2. We can see that it goes up. So that means that ionization energy and electronegativity have the same trend. They have the same trend. They increase as you go across and as you go up the columns. So this same pattern is for electronegativity and ionization energy. And so we can use document C and B or C and D to pull out that pattern. Now, we identified using document C and D for bullet point number 2, but let's figure out what documents we would want to use for other things. So in bullet point number 1, talking about like which group and whatnot, we definitely used document A to figure out it was an alkali metal. So let's use that for bullet point number 1. And then the third one was explain how this element reacts with other elements on the periodic table. Since, document B talks about the reactions of metals with chlorine, so we could talk about how it would react similarly to sodium with chlorine. So you could pull this in to bullet point number 3. But honestly, out of all the documents, document B isn't as helpful. So I highly recommend that you watch the videos going through how to analyze and go through these prompts and these documents, because it's a really good way to review your vocabulary, and we'll go into more about how to write the essay at a later time.